this on?
It was on.
Might not have sounded like a set of concluding remarks, but quite something to follow, Maury. So I have to agree wholeheartedly with Maury's exhortation. I wanted to focus on one aspect which I think is very necessary now for us to go forward, and that is the steering group that has been proposed. Let me start out by just picking up a few transparencies from Paul from this morning. Thank you, Paul. Just to go set the scene a little bit. I think we're in a most unusual but rather remarkable and very good situation here, in which we have this confluence where all three regions have come to a strikingly the same conclusion about what the priorities in high energy physics needs to be next. And I want to draw slightly different additional conclusions than Paul drew this morning. So from ECFA in August of this year, last year, I apologize, we got the recommendation, the realization in a timely a fashion as possible of a worldwide collaboration. In September, from our Asian community and colleagues regarding the linear collider, again, we must start an operation when the high luminosity run with LHC starts around 2009, 2010. Again, I see that as timely, soon. The exhortation that the Japanese should act as a host, but urges KEK to take initiative to investigate possible and practical forms of globalization of the construction. So then the most recent recommendation coming out of our own community, in the sub-panel draft statement, we recommend the highest priority of the UNIS program be a high-energy, high-luminosity electron-positron linear collider. We recommend the United States prepare to bid as host for the linear collider in a facility that is international from its inception. The thing that's striking about all three of these is they all make this the highest priority of the program. They all urge that we do this quickly, and they all urge the globalization of this project. I don't think I can recall that our community has so broadly focused on one initiative with this higher priority, at least in my recent times. Then, as Paul pointed out, additionally recommended by the HEPAP subpanel is to recommend the formation of a steering committee to oversee all linear collider activities in the U.S., and I want to focus my attention on a possible model for that. Now, it was noted by Paul, and it's certainly noted by inherent in what Maury said, that achieving a linear collider is not trivial. There are significant hurdles that have to be overcome. There's a lot to be done in this internationalization and producing a linear collider. And Paul listed some of those. It's an extremely challenging project. It costs more than projects of this kind that we have proposed before. And competition with other science projects in all three regions is very significant. And Paul talked about how we are faced with certain kinds of challenging questions. One in particular, he thought we had to tell out the government's people who fund us about was, why not wait until after the LHC? And I think it's equally important to recognize that we have to have a good answer to that question for our science colleagues as well, who will ask us and challenge us on that question. I believe that we have the answer to that. You might ask yourself, how did we come to this confluence of high priority recommendations in all three regions? I think it's quite simple. I think that's what's staring at us from the physics. The physics has driven us to this conclusion. I don't think we could have been there 4 years ago. I don't think 4 years ago the physics imperatives were that strong. But in the meantime, we have seen a lot of precision data from proton and electron machines. We've realized that the structure of electroweak symmetry breaking is almost certainly richer than a simple Higgs model. And when you put all those things together and you realize that one machine, the LHC, is not going to deliver the full answer. And that is the imperative, if you will, of the linear collider. Now, I know we're not here in Chicago to take decisions about how to organize the future, but it's time that we started to discuss how we proceed. In particular, I want to discuss the details of the U.S. Steering Committee. I think we need it soon. It's a necessary component. I think we should recognize it's a committee that will work closely with DOE, with NSF, with our colleagues, to steer a path to the future. I want to just remind us all that this is not project mode. This is not the time to set up a project organization. I think the steering group organization is probably something for which there isn't a perfect analog in our history. What we need to do is, embodied in that long list that Maury put forward, many of those things are social, political issues. They're organizational. They very much have to be done in a largely international framework. And that's a job that I think we've never quite undertaken. So we're not looking, in my mind, for a project organization. So what I want to put forward in the next 5 minutes is a straw model, if you will, something to be poked at, something to get us going on discussing this important issue. So let me start and remind us of what's been apparent in all of this discussion, which is where are we headed? Well, we're headed towards, I'm sorry, you probably can't see that. The goal here is to set up a laboratory, fully international, to build and construct a linear collider somewhere. What Maury guided us through a possible model for. And let me just put down that 2005 might be the time we would hope to realize this entity. And the question is, how do we get to that entity? Well, what we begin seeing forming are what I will call regional steering groups. There's already a steering group in Asia that's been formed, and Hirataga Sugawara is in charge of that. We are now talking about a U.S. steering group, and I would imagine that a comparable steering group will come out of the European organization. And out of these regional discussions and regional pushes has to come, finally, this international laboratory to build the linear collider. I think that it's inevitable that if we want to get from here to there, that we're going to have to put some intermediate structure in the middle of that. And I think if we want to get from our local regional steering groups through to this final laboratory, that we're probably going to have an international steering group or organization. And indeed, in order to do that, we're going to have to join with our government agencies in moving from the steering groups through an international steering group that finally is going to give us this organization. So it's in that context, then, that I think you should see the role of the U.S. steering group. Just to make it clear, this international steering group doesn't exist. It's something that we would have to encourage and hopefully get the other regions to agree to. Okay, so if we're going to have a steering group, it's going to need to be charged. And so what might be the elements of a charge? And again, these are some draft ideas that have been put together in a working group out at SLAC. You might, before you put together the elements of a charge, ask what the goal of the steering group is. I think the goal of the steering group should be to lead the U.S. participation in a fully international linear collider and to prepare the elements of a U.S. bid to host the project. In essence, the goal here is the and of the two recommendations that came out of the subpanel, namely participate in a fully international linear collider and host to bid it. You might then write down what you call the elements of a charge. You'll see a large overlap with these with what Maury wrote down, although they were done independently. The first element really repeats the goal: devise a roadmap for defining, internationalizing, funding, and carrying out the linear collider project. Second element would be make the linear collider case before the scientific community, Congress, and the American public, essentially be the face of the linear collider project for the U.S. Third element would be coordinate a comprehensive evaluation of competing options for building the linear collider, including technical feasibility and risk, cost, future expansion, and the implications of alternate sites. And a fourth element would be a similar parallel element for the detector: promote the exploration, evaluation, and development of competing designs and technologies for the linear collider detectors in an international context. Coordinate and support detector R&D within the US. So if those are in fact the elements of the charge, this is a big job. And it's a job that we have to get to, I would say, rather soon. So what kind of a framework would one think about for the steering committee? What I would suggest is a framework of the following kind for you to think about: that the steering group, which I again remind you has a lot to do, has a executive committee, if you will, a group of, let me call it 10-ish people that steer this effort. But those 10 people can't possibly do everything that needs to be done. They will need
replace it by a different technology.
Oh, it's cold. Okay, I'll give this one a try. This one's cold, right? Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay, so I was saying that there's a big task here. And what I'm calling the executive committee of the steering committee, something that involves about 10 people, can steer, but they won't be able to handle this larger job. They need help from the rest of the community. And by having subcommittees to this executive committee, one can then be able to assign homework, get some thoughtful work done to help the executive committee steer. In addition, one of the real advantages of having the subgroups is it draws in a larger number of people from the community into the decision making and into the steering. So would suggest 4 such subcommittees: one that can think about the accelerator issues, one that thinks about detector and physics issues, one that thinks about the internationalization. And in this group here, you have the opportunity to bring in fact, people from outside the US. And then one that deals with what you might call public and government relations. So those would be a suggestion for 4 subcommittees. I think this executive committee is something that's going to be meeting like weekly. Got a lot to do, a lot to launch. I would suggest that to get this going, basically the charge for the committee and the membership of the committee should be established by choosing chairs for this committee and having those chairs with the community, the US community, work with the DOE and NSF to come up with a charge and come up with a membership. Clearly the DOE and the NSF are crucial in this. They have to agree that this has the right members, that this is appropriately charged, and we would work with them. I would also think that a representative from the DOE, from the NSF, and I would also suggest HEPAP chair would be ex officio and attend the meetings of the executive committee to keep coherence. So the notion is that a little different than maybe what Maury was saying. I think this is basically the self-start model. It's a model that can get off the ground quickly. It doesn't have a board of overseers, which I think might slow the process down a lot and get going quickly. The community gets together with the agencies, flesh out a charge, flesh out a membership, and get moving. So I think 10 people is about what one could meaningfully have on an executive committee like this. I would recommend that the 10 people be roughly 5 from the laboratories and 5 from the university community. And I would suggest, as co-chairs, Mike, Maury, and myself could co-chair this executive committee. You probably would add 1 or 2 experts in the accelerator area. which might likely come from the big labs, and then you would balance that out with 5 people from the university community. So this then is the essence of the suggestion. A steering committee that has an executive committee of 10 people with, in addition, DOE, NSF, and HEPAP chair. That this committee is put together between co-chairs who we're suggesting are the lab directors, Maury, myself, and Mike, working with the NSF and DOE, who will obviously have consent on the charge and the membership. And then put together these subgroups and start working down that set of issues that were put down on the charge, or the suggested elements of the charge. As I said, this is a model for discussion, and I hope that it acts well in that regard. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Now, Mike Witherell.
Okay, it's been a long day, and I calculated that I would come on about this time, and so I therefore did not prepare transparencies because I thought all of them would be shown. So let me just make my remarks. First, I wanted to step aside from the program for a moment just to thank early, because it's the first day, but thank Mark Aurelia and his committee for putting on this show. The turnout has been very good, and a lot of new faces here, and it's actually been already been a very useful day, so thanks to Mark for that. So. Okay, so everything I have to say really reinforces things that Maury and Jonathan were saying. We know, first of all, that subpanel, even with subpanel recommendations in hand, there's a very long way to go to turn this idea into a reality. We are not even to the foothills yet. But the principles that, as Maury stated and others have stated, there should be one such linear collider in the world, built as an international collaboration. We need to pool together the material and intellectual resources of our worldwide community if we are to build this massive facility in a timely way. Moreover, our government, certainly our government in the U.S., I think all of them will ask why they should fund a multi-billion-dollar facility in our field, while in other major fields of science they're investing in large facilities that cost, say, $1 billion only. And as other people have pointed out, they don't really discriminate too finely between the differences between these fields. And the argument that just, well, we're high energy physics, we're the most fundamental, isn't quite what it takes to make that argument. So the answers to this question, I think, are one, that our field does have a clear consensus on the central scientific issues, and in particular the issues that need to be addressed by the LHC and a linear collider to explore fully are very large, very central to this field moving forward. The set of recommendations that have come from around the world back that up. But in addition, while large facilities such as light sources and free electron lasers, even neutron sources, are major instruments for important science, they are effectively regional projects. That is, there will be more than one in the world. There will be one in Europe, there will be one in the US, there will be one in Asia, there may be more. The linear collider will be a global project. Thus, that global nature is an essential part of motivating such a large expenditure. And it says, again, why we need to do it as an international project, do it right. And this will take a new structure to do that. I think that's what everybody is trying to address. The laboratories, high-energy physics, large laboratories around the world, and the community should lead the way in shaping that international collaboration. As Maury said, existing institutional structures must be made use of. Those are many of the major assets for our field. And we need to organize the project as a true collaboration of high-energy physics laboratories. And as many have said, the host country will be the one willing to contribute probably most of the finances. So the U.S. effort needs to be organized before it can effectively engage the international community in forming a global organization. So I have seen basically the ideas that Maury and Jonathan put forward. We've talked about those, and so I realize that I share those. We have a lot in common there, so not to go through them all again. They're a good starting point. Our laboratories need to take the lead with our community in putting this together. The tasks are, as people have said, political, educational, and diplomatic, as well as scientific and technical. There are a lot of tasks here to do. And one group needs to be coordinating all of these. So this is our task immediately ahead of us. We also need to engage other physicists in a discussion about how to promote better support for physical science as a whole. We are not going to do projects like this, and our physicists in other fields, certainly in this country, are not going to do what they need to do out of the present amount of funding that goes to physical science. That's been, as many people pointed out, has been decaying steadily over the last decade. So we need to be talking with our colleagues in other areas of physics about promoting physical science, how to do that. And in particular, we're going to be organizing a meeting at Fermilab with high-energy physicists from university groups around the country to talk about how to talk to our colleagues in physics departments. Not just about this project, but about the future of high-energy physics and the future of physical science, and how we can do that better together rather than firing at each other. So these are some of the issues we need to organize. We need to organize that large U.S. steering group. We need to organize this physics and detector working effort in the U.S., as will be discussed at this meeting. One thing we also need to organize is a way for the university physicists interested in working on accelerator R&D, and how to do that, and how to work with laboratories to do that, and how that will be funded. So we have a lot of issues ahead of us to work on. So I think I'll stop there. Everything else has been said. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think now we can ask Peter Rosen if he wants to say anything.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just give us a moment to adjust the microphone.
Sure, yeah.
Well, I think the microphone is adjusted now, so
Okay.
you can start.
First of all, let me apologize for not being with you. I'm trying to get over a cold that I developed over the holidays. You may hear it in my voice. I'd like to thank Mark for arranging this telephone hookup. I hope it works reasonably well. What I'd like to do, there's a lot of overlap between ideas expressed by the previous speaker and things that I would like to emphasize. The thing that I would like to pick up on particularly is the idea of the steering group that was put forward by the sub-panel. I think it's a very interesting idea. It was not too clearly spelled out in the sub-panel report as to, first of all, what its role would be, what its goal and its roles would be, and also what its structure would be. And we've heard some ideas from Maury and from Jonathan and Mike as to those things. What I'd like to do is try and emphasize some of the key roles that I think we need to think about, and I'd also like to do it in what is, I think, is an order of priority, which may differ from the way other people see it. The overall goal, of course, is to develop a coherent and coordinated effort by the U.S. national high-energy community, which will lead to U.S. participation in a fully international linear collider. Now, the roles of the steering group in the order of priority as I see it are first of all, to make the case for the linear collider to the U.S. high-energy physics community, the U.S. scientific community, Congress, and the public. Now, let me make a few comments on this. First of all, for this to be successful, the Linear Collider must have the strong, broad support of the U.S. high energy community. It must, as a community, there are obviously always going to be some people who may not agree with it, but the broad support of the community has to be very strongly behind this. That, I believe, is a sine qua non for getting off the ground. Now, the rest of the U.S. science community will need to be convinced that advancing high-energy physics, both science and technology, will, in the long run, enable science to advance on a broad front. I was very interested to hear what Mike said about the meeting he's planning to have at Fermilab. I think that's a very good step of how we talk to our colleagues in the physical sciences, and beyond, of course, because biologists, for example, have become major users, the fastest growing community of users for light sources, all of which comes out of our accelerator work. So I think there is a strong case that we can make that both our technology and even the facilities that we have built can eventually be put to use by other communities. One example is SSRL at SLAC, which was the spear machine at which Jape Psi was originally discovered. So I think that is a case that we need to work on and carry out effectively. I think we also need to emphasize the fully international nature of the Linear Collider. And I think that in making its presentations to members of Congress or the public or wherever they speak, I think it would be a very strong message if the groups that went around were international in nature, which suggests that the steering group ought to have at least one or two members from Europe and from Asia. In other words, to make it, give it a real international flavor from the beginning. The second point from my perspective is to develop a roadmap for U.S. participation in this fully international project. And what I have in mind here is that it needs to define a series of steps by which the community combines with the international community to arrive at a single proposal for a fully international linear collider. I think some of the problems associated with that and some of the things we need to be concerned with have already been discussed, but I think we really need to lay out a very clear series of steps as to what we're going to do, and of course some of them can be taken in parallel with one another. I think it should also develop a set of general criteria, such as the cost of construction and operation, the question of upgradability from some initial energy, like the 500 GeV that most people have talked about, the number of interaction regions, whether you want 1, 2, or even possibly more. And I think it should also speak to the capabilities and the optimal number of detectors for the initial physics program. These are all criteria that I think need to be clearly developed so that when it comes to making choices, we'll have a benchmark with which to compare things. Then, as others have said, I think we need to work with the international community to coordinate a comprehensive evaluation of competing options for a linear collider against the criteria that are developed in the roadmap. Obviously, this should include technical feasibility and risk. Estimated construction costs should be taken together with estimated operating costs. One technology might be more expensive initially, but on the other hand, its operating costs may be such that you can amortize the difference over a few initial years. I think we also ought to be open to innovative ideas. Maybe we need to use multiple technologies, as have just been used in Jonathan's talk. And even even maybe an asymmetric collider is something that one might look at to see whether it's something that has some virtue. And then obviously, from the point of view of detectors, we have to do the same job, and I assume that this is the main function of the meeting in Chicago today. So I think this thing is the interface with the funding agencies here in the U.S., that is the DOE and NSF, and I think it should also assist in developing ties to funding agencies abroad. There's a way in which the physics communities internationally have to get together, and also the funding agencies from the countries that are really interested need to find a way of understanding how we work and how we can work together. Some of that work is going on in the Global Science Forum Working Group, and I'm hoping that that will actually lead to some permanent group. Let me just comment on the structure of the steering group. I think the broad framework outlined by Jonathan is an interesting one to consider, namely some kind of central group which needs to be not so large as to be ineffective and not so small as to be really unrepresentative of the community. And it may be that a number like 10 is in between those two and works reasonably well. I think, as he points out, it certainly will need to have specific subgroups dealing with the specifics that he discussed. I'm not sure, and I say this carefully because one has not really examined it particularly clearly. I'm not sure that it's best for the community as a whole and for the progress of this project that the chairmanship of that group be the lab directors. I think the lab directors and the labs obviously have to play an important role in the steering group, and they are going to be the organizations that implement much of the work. But on the other hand, I think one needs to make it very clear through the symbolic leadership that this is really something that is coming out of the community as a whole. So I would be inclined at this point to see the lab directors involved in the steering group, but not necessarily as the chairs. Well, that's about all I have to say for the moment, and I'd be glad to answer questions or discuss as the time permits.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So how do we arrange the panel discussion now? We still have 25 minutes, so I suppose that the three major players come up here.
Perhaps we could have the house lights up.